Morning again to everyone. And we got a few things to talk about this morning. So some things I'm going to show you similar to slides I've showed you in the past, but a few changes and shifts in some of the dynamics. So we're going to get into that and look at kind of some 10-year trend history on varietal shifts and supply situation as well as pricing. We're also going to take a look at the future market outlook as well. So that's kind of what we're going to try to accomplish here this morning. And I'd like to start, as I always do, with the yellow potato segment. The reason for that is because it's experienced some great growth, unlike some of the other segments that we're going to talk about. And that continues this year. I'll show you in a second. There are some, however, I'm going to say caveats to that this year. I'm going to get more into that, but you're going to see some more continued growth, and that's really a good success story for what we're seeing in that category. This is a 10-year trend look at the production supply of yellow potatoes into the U.S. marketplace, again, over the last 10 years. You can see, just like the last number of years, I sound like a broken record here certainly, but we're moving up again, and it's by a not dissimilar amount to what it's done over the past 8 or 9 years certainly. And we're up to, we think we're going to hit about 13.7 million hundredweight total shipments of yellow potatoes in the U.S. category here this year. So that similar growth trend certainly continues there. But like I mentioned, that we are seeing maybe a tiny bit of a flashing, no pun intended, yellow light here, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. This is our year-to-date yellow tracker. This is for the first 22 weeks of this crop year. And you can see this is actually the first time we put increases in like a green box. This is the first time that we've seen a red box on this yellow slide, and actually a decrease in total shipments so far this year. So go back to that first slide I showed you on the total shipments being up. It's about 6% or so. And that would suggest that we're maybe running a little bit behind. It's nothing we're overly concerned about, except for that, yes, that is a downward number that we're seeing year over year. Against a 3-year average, it's almost flat, negative 0.1%, but that's really nothing, so we'll call that flat. So that is good, and things are still looking good there, but there are some indicators that would tell us, we need to be a little bit cautious here, kind of going forward with our yellow supply and make sure we're keeping that in balance, because that's always the goal, is to balance that supply and demand equation. That's when everything works well and growers get fair returns and people get what they want in the marketplace. That average 10-year growth rate of that first slide I showed you is actually 7.1%. That is down slightly from some of the past years that I showed you that. In fact, at one point that was as high as just a shade over 10%. But still a good positive growth rate, so it's a good success story and remains so. The growth rate year over last year, 6.5%. So we would certainly say that we believe that demand to be stable. It's maybe not the dramatic increase we're seeing, but based on the first 22 weeks of this year, we would certainly say that it's still stable. And pricing likewise remains stable, albeit it's another one of those signals maybe a little bit. It's ever so slightly lower than it has been here in the recent years. Not a lot, but if you use a 10 5-pound bale price or a tote size A as a kind of a proxy for return, because we don't have a specific grower return index in the yellow category, but that bale price in the $16 range, tote A in the $20 range, that actually might be, I think it's gone up slightly here in the last week or so that might be slightly higher. But again, very good, fair pricing and return, but not quite to the levels where it has been in the recent past. Again, as I've talked about this in the past before, there's no geographic region that necessarily dominates the yellow category. Unlike in russets and red potatoes, where in russets, Idaho obviously is the big player. We'll talk more about that, of course, later. And in the red category, the Red River Valley being the dominant player. In the yellow category, actually Idaho is now the top producer, supplier of yellow potatoes into the marketplace, but it's not by a wide margin. It's not like a dominant type of situation. Those are the top 5 that you see there: Idaho, the Red River Valley, Kern County in California, and the San Luis Valley in Colorado, as well as Florida. Those top 5 regions produce almost 60%, 57% of the total U.S. yellow supply. So that kind of gives you a sense that even the top 5 don't even make up quite 60%. So it's very spread out in terms of that yellow production. Canada, their supply to the U.S., actually, if they were, I kind of have this in there. I have this in there every year, by the way. If they were a state, no pun intended, to all my Canadian friends in the audience, it's something we've always had. And the last 8 years I've done this, it's what we use as a comparative measure to say if they were a state, they would actually be the #1 supplier. So I just hope by doing this over the last 8 years, I didn't give anybody any ideas about that. But I don't know if Mr. Trump watches our podcast or our event, but that'd be about 17% of the U.S. consumption, actually, in the U.S. comes from Canada. So the market supply volumes, like I said, they're still very strong, but we do need to always ask this question, and I've asked it for a few years now, you know, that top rung of the ladder that says, when you get up there, warning, do not step above this step, danger. We need to be cognizant of the fact that the marketplace dynamics do shift, and we've seen that in the past with the other categories and the other colors. We just need to be aware of that situation. Have we reached, or are we reaching that top rung of the ladder? All right, let's shift to the red segment. And this is also a little bit of a different dynamic than last year. We've had a slight rebound, as you can see here. Back in the mid-2010s is when the red supply into the U.S. totally kind of hit their peak, well over 15 million for a number of years there in the mid-2010s. It started to come down fairly dramatically over a couple of years and then flattened off again for 3 or 4 years down in that 12 million hundredweight range. Dropped again last year, and now we've seen this little bit of a rebound to 11.4 million, we'll call that. And that's what we're expecting from this current year. That still has yet to play out, obviously, but that's our projection at 11.4 million. That's up about 600,000 hundredweight from last year. Almost all of that is, that increase is kind of focused in the Red River Valley. And you remember I've talked about this in the past too, and the reason you see some of these variations from year to year is the fact that the Red River Valley is much more, I'll call it susceptible to Mother Nature, if you will, than some of the other areas, because almost all the fresh, I think all of it actually, is grown on dry land. So Mother Nature controls a lot more there in the valley in terms of the fresh red and yellow supply than it maybe does elsewhere. So the vagaries of what happens with Mother Nature can play a big role sometimes in that supply situation out of there. But we are seeing that a very nice, good crop this last year, so we're seeing that rebound. It wasn't necessarily that their acreage went up dramatically. In fact, red actually went down ever so slightly, and a little more shift to yellows as we've continued to see. But yeah, 11.4 million is what we now expect from the red shipments this year. This is the red tracker, similar to the yellow one that I just showed for the first 22 weeks of this current crop year. You can see those negative numbers there. We've had a few challenges this year, quite honestly, with some of the reporting, and we try to do our very best to provide accurate and good information. So we use the stocks on hand, for example, that the Red River Valley provides, and try to triangulate this and make sure our model is getting the best data it has. We think we've done that here, but keep in mind that there are some vagaries sometimes in that situation with USDA reporting. But we are seeing a little bit of a down percentage over last year, even though the total crop is up. But it certainly does not feel like in the red category that there's any kind of an issue or a concern there. It feels like, especially in the Red River Valley, that we're in a good spot, and we believe that will continue throughout the rest of this year. The average 10-year growth rate in the red supplies there that I showed in that first slide is a little bit of a negative there. As you can see, negative 3% per year. The major shifts from last year in the red category saw a pretty dramatic increase in the Red River Valley that I talked about earlier, 40% or so. Kern County in California as well as Texas also saw a little bit of increase. There was decreases though in other areas. Central Minnesota had some challenges this year in the Big Lake area with their red crop. Wisconsin also shifting more production again more into yellows, but also pretty significantly down in reds in a lot of cases. Canada's red supply, they would be second. Red River Valley, of course, is the primary supplier like I talked about earlier, but they would actually be second. So they also supply, it's a similar number, I think 15 or 16% of total U.S. supply does come from Canada. So between the reds and yellows, they do comprise a large component of that. It's not quite the case, obviously, or even close to those numbers in the russet category, but in reds and yellows, good supply from up there. Pricing, the red pricing has enjoyed a little bit of an increase over last year. It's about on par with the 5-year average, which is another reason it tells us that we believe the market to be in good stead. Those prices are and have been remaining strong. Current pricing, again, using size, tote size A as a proxy, it's in that 21, 23 range, maybe even slightly stronger than that in some cases, but that's kind of where we're at right now. So it's a very good situation. This shows that trend that I talked about that we've been seeing for a few years. A couple of years ago when we kind of saw this coming, we said, when is that actually going to flip? When are we going to see yellows go past the red supply in the marketplace? That happened a couple of years ago. And the trend, just like you've just seen, has definitely continued. So now, question is that going to continue? Is that going to level off in the red situation? Is it going to continue to grow in the yellow situation? Should it continue to grow? Will we keep that supply and demand in balance? Obviously yet to be determined, but that's kind of what we're showing here. So that's what it would look like if it continued the way it currently trends. All right, let's flip to russet potato category, the largest category by far. And this is the 10-year look, just like in the other categories, of what the supply has been. So you see it scattered around a little bit, but certainly if you put a trend line on that, it would be in the decidedly downward direction. But yeah, kind of peaking back in that certainly wasn't the peak back in 2016, but that's the highest on the last 10-year record, almost 75 million. But we've not been really anywhere close to that in a long time. And the last year we had 67.8 million, we'll call it. That was up pretty significantly from the prior year, which you remember, though, everybody remembers those 2 years. That was a couple of years after COVID. The very much lower supply. That was the lowest on record in the 2022 crop. Growers all remember that, or they should remember that. It was a great return year, one of the best we've ever seen on record. That was almost 63 million, 62.8 million shipped into the marketplace. That rebound back to the 67 when everybody thought, the sky's falling, there's way too much supply, and it was certainly, relatively speaking, a big increase from the prior year, but you can go back and compare that to some of those previous years and say, why was that perceived as such a huge crop? So, a lot of things like elsewhere has become psychology in the marketplace and how people think about pricing and how last year may affect the thinking going forward and all those kind of things. But yeah, that's kind of how it played out. Now the drop to this year would suggest that, yeah, I think things are back a little more in balance, should be 65.3 million is what we're now projecting from this current crop that we're shipping for this year. So yeah, you would suggest, yeah, that's not as low as, those years, certainly 2022, but it's back into a little more normal marketplace range. I'll show you in a minute, though, what's kind of happening in the pricing side of things and how that's, in some cases, not kind of translating, but this is how it looks for the last 10 years. I always like to show kind of a breakdown to kind of set the landscape and how the dynamics of the marketplace kind of shake out in terms of the geography of where these russet potatoes come from. As everyone would expect, you see Idaho there is by far and away the largest russet supplier into the marketplace, 48%. That's about the same percentage, if you remember, as it was from last year. Now, a couple of years ago, remember that very low production rate. That was, I think Idaho was at either 43 or 44% that year. So that was a pretty big shift up over the last couple of years, but back up to 48%. San Luis Valley's second at 18%, and then Wisconsin and the Columbia Basin both ship about 8% of the market. So those four big shipping areas ship about between 80 and every year, usually between 80 and 85% of the total russets in the marketplace. So obviously the big players, those four areas. It's not that those other areas aren't important; they certainly are. But you can kind of see how they play out to northeast Colorado and Nebraska, that little geographic sector there, Texas, Canada, other. Michigan's a fairly big chunk of other. So that's kind of the perspective of how the whole marketplace lays out in terms of supply percentages. Let me get forward here. So this is a little bit of a busier graph than the other categories, so I'll try to explain this a little bit. But those bars, each one of those bars represents the supply into the marketplace by week. So the blue bars to the left-hand side of the graph are actual supply for this current shipping year right up to New Year's here, so just a week or so ago. The orange bars going forward are our forecast for the remaining shipments by week if it was shipped at a normal patterns and normal pace based on the remaining stocks on hand. And then the background, the kind of lighter colored background is the 5-year average, and the dotted line across the top, lighter dotted line, is the last year's shipment numbers. The other two heavy dashed lines are the grower return index, so you can see the shipments kind of juxtaposed with that shipping pace, that pattern over the years. And you can see what happened last year. So we were coming off, like I said, in that 2022 crop, a very significant high right here. That grower return index was up around, we finished that year at around $22. I think that's about what it averaged for the year. So just incredible type numbers, like I said, that had never seen before. Based on that, again, that psychology and that bigger crop that we had coming, it started dropping fairly rapidly through the harvest window. By the time the cellar doors went shut here in the early part of October, it was already down into that $10 range, and then just kind of drifted downward the rest of the year accordingly as those big shipments, again, relatively speaking, started coming out of particularly Idaho, but a lot of other areas as well. So that's where it finished last year, last summer, last August. That's where we finished down in that $5 range. So again, talking about the psychology and how that started with this new year, that's obviously where it starts. Now there was some optimism, I guess you'd say, even though there was big carryover as well. We all remember the carryover that came in from the old crop. We had plenty of that. So that played a role too in that whole dynamic and that supply situation through this window here, even into, well into September actually. So, but it did see a little bit of a rebound. Now that's not great, but at least it did come back up into that $7, $8 range, started drifting a little bit after the harvest window, but then pretty flat since then, pretty stable, I guess you'd say now. Stable is a relative term because stable in a not great situation is not great. So even though it has stabilized, it's not in a spot where we would say it's price positive for a grower meeting his cost of production. So that's not a great thing from that standpoint. So speaking of that, I always try to look for a little bit different or innovative ways to communicate the fact that the potato supply market is very inelastic. And by that I mean, as I've talked about in the past and shown in different ways, small changes in the supply side of things impart a much larger change in the grower return side of the equation. So you can have a small change in the upward direction of supply in any given year, and that's going to have a much outsized negative effect on the pricing side of the equation that year on the grower return side. And by the way, it works in both directions. So small increases, you get a much bigger decrease in return. and vice versa. So I'm going to use Idaho as an example of this to try to explain this. I think I showed this scatter graph last year, but not the next couple I'm going to show. That's more more detailed in how it really impacts a grower and his actual return. We developed this using our models. We took 10 years worth of data and crunched it through our models to try to arrive at a curve that says, okay, if we apply any given supply in a given year, what can we expect for a return? And so that line that I'm going to show you here on these next two charts was developed in this way. I just wanted to show you this to show you how it was developed. Each one of those dots represents an individual year, and it's the juncture where the supply situation in Idaho meets the grower return index for that year's total average across the entire year. So you can see how that model uses that regression and fits that curve into there. This is how Idaho finished last year. This was last summer. I think it was July 30, looks like. That red dot there over just above that 32.5 million, and that's what Idaho wound up shipping in total. This is russets, by the way, only, so they also ship a lot of reds and yellows, so their total shipment numbers look different than this if some of you are comparing to that, but their total russet shipments was just a shade over 32.5 million. So it kind of hit right on that line that curve that the model developed, and that average return was a little over right around $7 there, $6.98 actually, and it hit right on that line. The return, I show this as a point of reference, that green dot in the upper left-hand corner, that is the return from the 2022 crop. That was the record I was talking about. You can see what Idaho shipped there, just a shade over 26.5 million, and those returns were fantastic that year, obviously. But that's just a point of reference there. The other point of reference that I want to try to show on this is the cost of production and where you would have to hit on that line to achieve that cost of production. That would hit just a little bit between 29 and 29.5 million if you use Idaho's cost of production. This is last year, so $12.50. Now again, that cost of production, that's an average. It's an index to use. Nobody gets exactly that. It could be a lot less than that. It could be even a little more in some cases. But that's for potatoes that are on fumigated ground, and it's for the southern region of eastern Idaho, stored and shrunk into February. So it's kind of an all-in number for that in storage through February. But just kind of use that as, again, as just a guide, an index or a gauge. For a reference point on this. And you can see that's where you would have to hit. That's the differential right here. That distance right there is the differential in the return. If you extrapolate that and apply it to all the potatoes that were shipped, that number there is how much total Idaho growers would have lost last year, $180 million. That's a big number. Now keep in mind this is somewhat rudimentary because this does not include contract pricing, and it does not include volumes that are on contract. So that's becoming, even in Idaho, a much, much bigger chunk of the pie, so keep that in mind. This is only if you used all fresh, so it's that number probably is not nearly that big, but it gives you a sense of the total dynamics if it were all shipped fresh, or if somebody did ship all open market fresh, what that loss would potentially look like. All right, let's look at this current year that we're in. I don't have that box showing the loss because we're not through that year yet and don't want to depress anybody any further, but this is what we're currently looking at. This is what Idaho's projected shipments are. Now that's down. This green dot here, by the way, is last year, the one off to the right there. That's last year's total shipment numbers. And that's where it came out, just around $7 like we saw on that previous graph. So they did reduce supply this last year all the way down to just a shade over 31 million. And their grower return to date is still, and that's an average to date across all North Dakotas and Burbanks, just a bit under $8, $7.30. Even this chart would say, that should be a little higher than it is. It should at least be up on that line. If not, move further up that line, but certainly up to that line, and it's not even quite there. So the new cost of production number, thanks to Ben Eborn on this, he kind of gave us a little bit of a preview of it. He's going to have that coming up in our potato conference in Idaho here in a couple of weeks, but and I'll talk more about that too in a second. But we believe that to be $12.27, so that's down a little bit from the previous year. But again, you can see that differential there between where a break-even number for potatoes stored that long and shipped after February would be. It's not an insignificant number, again, as we've talked. So again, just wanted to demonstrate that inelasticity and how this marketplace really kind of works in the russet category. I like to show this chart because a couple reasons. First of all, it really demonstrates the value of potatoes. And secondly, to kind of talk about the dynamics of how we ship into the marketplace when we have excess supply. This is if a consumer walked into your local supermarkets with $1 to spend, and you had $1 in your pocket. How many pounds of each of this basket of vegetables could you buy for that? We track on a weekly basis the National Retail Ad Report, as well as the Retail Promotional Pricing Report, and we kind of consolidate that into we call it a purchasing power number. So that, again, that $1 you could walk in to your local Albertsons and buy a half a pound of green beans. But you can see potatoes at the very top end of this category. It tells you that they're a tremendous value for what's being promoted out there in the retail sector. Red potatoes, yellow potatoes certainly, but look at russet potatoes right now. All three of those are always near the top of that chart, but russet potatoes right now are being heavily promoted given the current circumstance and volumes being shipped into the marketplace. So you could go almost double of everything else and go in and buy 2¼ pounds of russet potatoes for that $1 you have in your pocket. So again, the nutritional value for potatoes, just like Kim talked and Potatoes USA promotes, is certainly there. And we can't forget that either, that potatoes are a tremendous value at the store. It also demonstrates kind of what we do in situations where we believe the supply to be somewhat in excess, we'll say, and that's promotion. Promotional activity is key, and you can see that that's being done very well with potatoes. So I kind of always like to show this. It gives a pretty good snapshot of how that kind of comparatively happens in the marketplace with the other basket of vegetables. All right, let's talk a little bit about the 2025 outlook. This is always kind of interesting, and how we think about things and how growers are thinking about things, of course, in the planting decision window, where that's usually we kind of try to think about it in terms of maybe October through December of the late fall and early winter. Even now, obviously, there's planting decisions being made. So what are growers thinking about? How are they looking at things? And this is one of the things we look at. I show this every year, and again, this is courtesy of North American Potato Market News. We're very appreciative of having them as a partner and working with Ben and working with our models and our numbers. But this is how the model works to kind of suggest what an acreage change for the coming year overall across the total U.S. would look like. And the key drivers in it are those top two, the Idaho GRI and wheat pricing. And what drives it is the year-over-year changes, and then going back into the model and using that to say, okay, compared to other years, how does this all play out? The Idaho GRI, even with last year's lower numbers, you remember from the chart I showed, are even down slightly from last year. So down to 742. Again, that's for the period of October through November. So 742 was the average GRI over those months in Idaho. That's down almost 9% from the previous year. However, alternative crop pricings, just like you heard Stephen talk about all this in this presentation as well, down even more, wheat in particular, in that time slot. And you can look at different time slots, but again, we're trying to look at when growers are making those planning decisions in those windows for those specific periods. So that's obviously can be different for any kind of comparison you use, but wheat there, almost 20% down year over year in the as an alternative crop price. So what does that mean? The other thing that factors into how growers thinking about these things and looking at them, I talked about this earlier on that Idaho graphic, is the cost of production. And again, thanks to Ben for providing this, we'll get the exact number. That 2024 is certainly a projected number at this point, but we do believe it came down a little bit again. You can see how it goes. We've talked about this before. You know, the big jump started occurring in 2020 and then through 2020, actually 2021, but that 2021 number, always a little bit of lag time, probably actually even slightly higher than that, but got all the way up to 1262. That was the high point. Since then, it's been more moderated, a little bit of tapering off to 1227 that we're projecting now. Fertilizers, fuel, as you all know, has come down a little bit. Interest rates have come down slightly. On the flip side, labor costs certainly are going to continue to be a challenge and going up in a lot of areas of the country. So there are some puts and takes in this and a lot of inputs. So again, use this as just a guideline and kind of an index as a reference point, so to speak. So what does that all mean, and how does it all factor in, and what are some of the other things that we're looking at and thinking about, and the same as what growers are going to be thinking about and looking at? Weaker alternative crop pricing, just like we looked at, more or weaker than even the Idaho GRI, which was slightly weaker, like I showed you from last year. So weaker alternative crop pricing would suggest, well, there's not good alternatives. There might be more acreage planted in potatoes. But weaker GRI in Idaho would suggest maybe there'd be less potatoes planted because growers are thinking about less money. So some puts and takes there. Cost of production, like we talked about, moderated and actually slightly decreased. There's always this specter of seed supply out there and water. It's always fun things to talk about, but when it's all said and done, those things usually never have a huge impact on things. The water situation, and particularly in eastern Idaho, that many of you have heard about, has been mitigated. They've reached an agreement for at least the near future, so that all looks good. So there's really no concern or issues there, kind of on the immediate horizon anyway. So that's a good thing. The processing situation, you heard Kim talk about this, and Dale, thanks to them for kind of walking through this a little bit, because it's a little bit fluid, I would suggest right now. There's certainly some moving parts. I put demand variability just because, you know, different frozen processors target different markets and different customers, so depending on that, it kind of has a little bit of an impact on their demand outlook and kind of where they're at in the scope of things on overall demand. But certainly it continues to remain strong, just like Kim showed in the projection, like Dale talked about. If it's up, you know, a year ago, Dan and Brett talked about this, I think even a couple of years ago when Brett Nedrow presented here, is that, you know, that global marketplace in that 3.5%, 4% range is not unheard of at all. In fact, that was definitely the projection in the forecast. That's moderated now, just like Dale talked about, if that's more like a 0.5% or 1%. But if it rebounds a little bit further, it's still a positive number, I guess, is part of the point. So that all has to be kept in mind as well. Production capacity shifts. You heard Dale talk about the new expansions that almost all major processors are either underway. You also, on the flip side, have closing of it's a much older facility in the system in Washington and the Connell. But all those things continue to evolve as well. You got the global landscape we've talked about. You heard Cedric talk about this and others, Kim as well, about the international organizations that are looking at building in the United States. On the flip side, you have expansions in those areas as well, and more imports, just like you heard, coming into the U.S. So all those dynamics are moving as well. You have some continuing, and this affects the fresh market as much as anything, quite honestly, but it's more of that rationalization of excess raw material. It happened last year pretty significantly, but it even is happening again this current year, and even a little bit more of that to come probably. So obviously you have to keep an eye on that and how that's going to affect which channels it may go into. The hope is, and the thinking is that it will not go, you know, hopefully disrupt other channels, but That's always something to think about and keep an eye on. Contract pricing. Those negotiations, I think, are, I don't know if it's quite complete, but nearing completion, I guess I would say, Dale. But good there, I think, in terms of having it done. But on the flip side, there's always good pricing pressures on that side of the equation too. So other external market factors, things like international market access. Mexico has been a terrific opportunity, and thank goodness we've had that. Not that things would have been drastically worse, but certainly they helped the situation, especially last year and again this year, having that access to the Mexican market open. We need to stay vigilant on that, as Cam will tell you, and he'll be talking more about that this week as we go along, but we need to make sure that we keep that market open there. Japan access is going to be kind of the next big thing, hopefully, that we can get. That's a slog, and it's going to take some time, but we're hoping to get there. Ag labor uncertainties are probably going to do nothing but continue, so all those factors also have to be taken into account. So you can see there's tons of moving parts into how you think about what to plant next year. The model would suggest that acreage would be slightly down, actually probably about 1%, maybe 1.5%. That's not a lot, so kind of in that range to flat is what the model would suggest. But again, a lot of other things that go into the thinking on how this all could play out. But just to give you an idea of what we kind of saw there with the model. I've learned long ago not to put that down in writing, so you don't see that on a bullet point here, but that's what our model is kind of suggesting. I'll just leave you with this, as I always do, that just kind of keep in mind, again, it's back to that inelasticity discussion a little bit, but if we return to the volume shift of prior years, the way the market tends to price that and the psychology of how that works, they tends to value the crop as same as it did in those years of where those volumes were. So please keep that in mind as well. So that's what we were trying to show with some of those Idaho example slides and on how that dynamic works. So, all right, thank you.